Welcome to the Mechanical Ink podcast, a collection of conversations about the open source ecosystem. We speak with maintainers and companies that play a key role in ensuring the health and sustainability of open source today and in the future. Hey, Stephen. Welcome to the Mechanical Ink podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I found out about you and one specific topic you were working on at the moment on the to-do group on Slack. And but before we dig into any of the specific topics, you have a very interesting background and you do a whole bunch of stuff. You write a lot. So can you give us like a bit of background about yourself, how you got to where you are and what your interests are?
Sure. I've been writing about technology and the businesses of technology since the late 80s. And before that, I worked as a system admin, network admin, programmer, bottle washer, you name it, for the United States Space Agency, NASA, and also some for the Department of Defense. Along the way, though, I discovered I'm pretty darn good at hands-on technology. I was even better at explaining it in English to people who didn't have the first clue about technology. I actually discovered that both those things were true on one rather odd occasion when I was working at the Goddard Space Flight Center library, and we had a library program that was going badly wrong. And I was working at the library proper, not as a developer, but I was looking over their shoulders at the code they were looking at, which was IBM 360 assembler, as managed by JCL, Job Control Language. And I said, well, guys, we've got this problem here that it can't seem to find the data, but here, if you, at the beginning of this do-while loop, you took the data off, rather you took the DASD, the hard drive of the time, off, so that when it tries to write to it, it doesn't have anywhere to write to, so it just falls through, and that's why it's crashing. And they looked at me, and I looked at them, and vice versa, and they started looking at the code, and the head librarian looked at me and said, what are you talking about? What do you mean? I said, well, it's like you take a filing cabinet and you take the file folder out of the cabinet, and then when you try to drop some paper back in that folder, the folder's not there anymore. So the paper just drops to the bottom of the filing cabinet and nothing gets filed. And she looked at me and I looked at her and she said, well, why couldn't you? She looked at all of us and said, well, why couldn't you explain it to me that way? And so it was actually in about 5 minutes, I realized that, it wasn't just my imagination. I actually could read fairly esoteric code quite easily, and I could explain it in English to someone who had no clue what that was. So, and that actually sort of set my career in motion, because they quickly said, well, you are now the programmer in charge of this project, which didn't impress IT any, but eventually they came along, and I also started writing about this stuff, and here I am today. And along the way, I also, mainframes were actually my very first hands-on computer work, but after that, though, I quickly moved on to Unix and using C on VAX machines and early PDP P11s, all that kind of stuff, and AT&T 3B2s. Spent a lot of time in the mini computer world. And then PCs were coming on. This was, again, still in the late 80s. And so I started doing more with them. And eventually I decided I could probably make more money and be more helpful working on computers than rather writing about technology and computers rather than just continuing to work on them. Because while I'm a decent programmer and a pretty good network admin, I'm a better writer. And I also pick up things very quickly, which is really helpful in our business because if you blink twice, you know, oh, I'm sorry, that all that stuff you learned about Go, well, forget it, it's Rust now, or fill in the blank.
That is very, very true. And that actually brings up a topic that I had on the list. You wrote about the fact that in version 6.1 of the Linux kernel, they have added support for Rust to be able to do kernel development with Rust.
Right?
And in your article in the Register, you
Mm-hmm.
say that this could be a game changer.
Right.
I know Rust is like everywhere I go, people are talking about Rust. I contract with Mozilla, who started the whole development of Rust. And so I'm curious about how you see this being the game changer when it comes to the Linux kernel.
Well, first let me just say that when Mozilla let go of Rust, I kicked them in print a couple of places saying, guys, this is the future. And sure enough, here we are. And it is becoming the future for a lot of major projects. Uh, the reason I say that about Linux in particular is Linux, of course, is what everything runs on now. Even people on their Windows machines and Macs, they may not be able to tell a Bourne shell from a C shell from a bash shell. Doesn't matter. The vast majority of applications they run are now software as a service apps, and behind those applications more often than not are running on Linux one way or the other. And when that's great and that's good. And for someone who cut his teeth on Unix, that makes me feel really good that I followed the right path. I thought this would be the way of the future, and turns out I was right. But Linux is like Unix before it was written in C. And C is a very difficult language in many ways. Perhaps the most critical way for security purposes is it's really hard to do memory management properly in C. It can be done. There are some extensions that make it safer. All of that is true. But at the end of the day, it is trivial to write C that works perfectly well, except it's incredibly sloppy with its memory handling, and really bad things can and do happen on a regular basis thanks to that. So now Rust comes along. It's fast, it's low level like C, so you can get your hands really right there into the hardware. Where you're first going to see Rust actually make a real impression, and it already is in the Linux world, is in drivers. And if you're writing a driver, which is, that connection between the hardware and the software, you've got to be at a really low level programming to get that to work properly. And Rust has this great blessing that it has memory management baked in from the very beginning. With Rust, you can still certainly make lots of security mistakes and blunders, but the easiest of the mistakes to make in C of memory management are nigh on to impossible to do in Rust. You actually have to try really hard to blow memory up in Rust. And so what I see happening here is that, well, two things. One, this will make Linux safer as time goes on and more mechanisms, particularly drivers and some libraries associated with drivers, are written in Rust. And at the same time, it's also going to help bring in a new generation of developers because the Linux kernel community it's graying out. I mean, yes, there are certainly new developers coming in all the time, and people like Greg are always encouraging new developers to walk in, and it actively encourages them and helps them into the kernel. There's a fear out there by a lot of programmers that the Linux kernel is a really scary, scary place, and that Linus will bite your head off if you make a mistake. And if you make a big enough mistake, yes, he will, but it's actually much more welcoming than people think. And particularly with people like Greg and Shua Khan, who are more than happy to help wet behind the ear C developers get into it. But the important thing is C developers are still, you've got to be pretty darn dedicated if you really want to master C. Rust also, it's got a learning curve too, but it's simply a lot easier to use, and it certainly is much easier to write productive low-level code that's safe in with Rust without a lot of education. So it is the hope of the kernel community that this embrace of Rust will help bring in a new generation of developers. Now, that's not to say that anyone's going to take the millions of lines of code of Linux and rewrite it in Rust. That's not going to happen anytime this decade, anyway. Developers being developers, I'm sure someone is going to try to rewrite the entire thing in Rust eventually, because that's just the way programmers are. But in the meantime, it's going to be really helpful, both to develop a larger community for Linux and to make Linux itself safer. And since again we use Linux everywhere now, anything that helps makes Linux inherently more secure is a very good thing for all users and developers.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds like a really promising move. And yeah, I have to agree. I agree on the thing that if somebody will try and rewrite it in Rust.
It's what we do.
Very true.
Not me, but
So talking about, yeah, no, I know. I speak to people often that's very excited about Rust, and so they're just trying to find things they can rewrite in Rust to make it better and faster and stuff like that.
right.
So there's two topics I want to touch on. I'm going to start with the one angle, and that is that there was a couple of companies that was fully open source, such as MongoDB, Elastic. I think Redis was one of
Mm-hmm.
those as well, and that have over the last couple of years or so moved to this inner source model kind of thing, with a kind of
Mm-hmm.
open source friendly kind of license. Um, and
Right.
I saw that actually Amazon, which I was kind of surprised by, um,
Mm-hmm.
took Elasticsearch, forked it, and created a fully
Mm-hmm.
open source fork called OpenSearch. So
Right.
I'd like to know your thoughts just on this whole idea. Like, is there a way? Because I think I kind of understand why some of these companies do that. It's like from a, like we need to pay salaries, and people can't always work for free, all this stuff. How do you see those two worlds work together, where you keep your open source thing open source, but you're still able to make build a company around it?
Well, I there are several issues there. I believe the fundamental one is that people mistake open source, which is a software development model, for a business model, and it's not. Never has been. It can be extremely useful uh, for building a business, but you can't just assume that somehow magically open source will solve your business revenue problems and all your supply chain concerns. It just doesn't work that way. Again, it's a great software development model. It is not inherently a good business model. So a lot of these companies early on are delighted with open source because it helps bring in developers to them. They get people who help them build their code, And that's great. They are able to much more quickly go to market with whatever their product or their service may be. But again, it's not a business model. And so they then realize what they try to do is they go to an open core model where it's some of the code is open source, the heart of it is, but all the extensions and frameworks or whatever that you need to make it useful, those are proprietary. Those you're going to charge money for. Or you change the license so that you very deliberately exclude uh, software as a service providers from using your software. And those are not, they're no longer open source companies at that point. They like to say that they are, but they're not. They've become something rather different. Uh, and that can be really annoying to some developers. I mean, yes, I can certainly understand that if you're in the company, you want to find a way to monetize your code. But if you're, say, I'm a developer who worked on one of these projects, but I'm not a member of the company, and now you're telling me that I signed this copyright agreement and you now control my code, even though I'm the original writer and this was an open source project, yeah, that does not go over well with a lot of developers. At the same time, I can certainly understand how these other companies they look at particularly at the hyperscale cloud people, and they say you're taking our code and you're making money with it. And the reason why they're making money with it is because their business model was never the software. Their business model was providing the services, the hardware infrastructure layers you needed to turn raw code into a easy to consume service rather, that could be used by anyone to do work. And so it was that AWS, looked at this and said this licensing change with Elastic was very deliberately designed so that we could no longer do it, that customers would have to work with Elastic. And AWS said, well, okay, if you really want to do that, you can, but we're going to take the code before you split it off, and we're going to do a true open source version of it, because again, our business model does not depend on this illusion that the code itself could intrinsically become valuable. We are going to open source it so that you can run it on our machines, or for that matter, you could take that code, you could run it on Azure, you could run it on Google Cloud, you could run it on Linode, you name it. It's truly open source. You can run it anywhere. And we think, though, that you're going to prefer to keep going with us. In the end, both companies apparently are doing rather well with this. Some customers have indeed gone ahead with Elastic, and they're buying into the Elastic model of doing things. Others have said, you know what, AWS works for us, and we'll just continue to use this AWS specified Elastic, and we'll happily work forward with that. Uh, these battles are going to continue for the foreseeable future. Again, I really encourage companies, though, that are investing in open source technology to really take a long, hard look at what they're doing and at their business model. And also, for that matter, what I see happening with a lot of these companies is they're in their ABC, well past ABC rounds of funding. They've got all these people it's not so much that the developers need pay. Most of these companies have always been able to pay their developers. It's all the initial rounds of funding people who want, the only reason venture capitalists invest in a company is they want to see double, triple, quadruple their money. They're not interested in making money as a conventional business. They're interested in baseball terms, home runs. rather than singles. They're interested in free point shots. They're not interested in how good you are at shooting free throws, to use basketball as an analogy. So I really think a lot of the push to move into these new open core licenses or inner source versions, that's being driven more by VCs, I think, than anyone else.
That's very interesting. That's well said. Yeah. The other flip side of the coin is the other thing that another technology stack, so to speak, that you've talked about that is enjoying explosive growth is called OpenStack. I've looked
Right.
at it in the past a little bit and then kind of forgot about it. And then when I saw
Mm-hmm.
your article, I was like, oh, yeah. And I started looking at the site and I'm like, this is really interesting. For
Mm-hmm.
those of us that don't know about OpenStack or what exactly it is, could you unpack that for us a little bit?
Sure. The fundamental description of OpenStack is it's a open source infrastructure as a service software stack, though it has expanded greatly underneath its umbrella organization, Open Infrastructure Foundation. It also incorporates continuous integration and continuous deployment now, networking, you name it, anything that you want in a cloud stack, you pretty much can find somewhere in the open infrastructure, OpenStack universe. But unlike the hypercloud people, they never tried to turn it into a company. There have certainly been companies involved in it that have worked with it. Rackspace, the Texas-based hosting company slash cloud company, were the first ones to invest in it. But now it's a pure software play, and it's a variety of companies have come together. This is software that it's not like when you think of the traditional open source developer, you think of individuals scratching their own itch. This was always about companies and organizations scratching the need for that for a cloud service. And so in a way, actually, this springs very forth very naturally from our earlier conversation, because this is an open source project which was always all about the cloud per se, and that anyone can run this cloud. Um, Now, over the years, it's done a lot of things, and where it has really grabbed people's attention in the business universe is in the telecoms, because companies like Verizon in the United States and Deutsche Telekom, China Mobile, it's it's a global phenomena. All these telecoms, they look at what the hypercloud people are doing and say, well, yes, we need that same sort of gigantic global range of services, but we do not. Boy, do we not want to put the crown jewels of our businesses, 5G and so on, into the hands of a Microsoft Azure. We want to run it ourselves on our own machines. Where can we find a soup to nuts software stack that will cloud stack that will let us do that? And they looked at OpenStack and said, this works actually. So now they're all very heavily invested in it, and it's it's become it's one of those hidden infrastructure programs. I mean, people using their 5G phones don't know that underneath it, the odds are pretty darn good that there's an OpenStack cloud running all of it in the background, but it often is. And it's not just though for that particular vertical, though that's an enormous vertical. It's
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
also very
Yeah.
useful in a lot of other places. Some companies are using it to provide. I think it's Deutsche Telekom actually is they have their own cloud offering, sort of a somewhere between the Google Drive and the mega clouds, clouds for business people who are not mega business people who don't need all the bells and whistles of an AWS, but they still want a lot of cloud
Hmm.
service. They're using OpenStack to provide their customers with those services. And it's going pretty well.
Another industry that I don't know much about, but I find very interesting after reading some of your articles, is the fintech industry. I have an ex-colleague that has moved into a fintech company that's a new startup in also
Hmm.
in Texas. But in like the article that you wrote, you mentioned that VCs have kind of said that they think open source fintech startups such as Move, OpenBB, A16Z
Right,
can be sets up fintech to kind of be the next industry for open source to disrupt. And I think if there's an
right.
industry that needs this disruption, but that has kind of been disrupted by this whole cryptocurrency thing, but maybe this new idea with open source disrupting this industry could be something more sustainable. Can you tell us a bit more about how the fintech industry is? Because there's some associations you've talked about, the Open
Right,
Source in Finance Foundation and the FinTech Open
right,
Source Foundation. These are also not as
right,
foundations I've ever heard of. So if you can just like
right.
give us like a nice overview of
Okay.
this entire industry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me open by saying that I'm a crypto cynic. I think it's all just a. I have a nice Dutch tulip here. I'll be happy to sell you for say Bitcoin, and I assure you that tulip in the by say 2026 will be more valuable growing in your garden than that Bitcoin was. But leaving that aside, that's actually sort of you know all the crypto coin currencies are actually sort of a side issue, and I'm afraid they really are just. It's just an enormous scam. I know it's an enormously popular scam as well, but I've seen a lot of scams come and go, and then at the time, everyone is enthusiastic about them, but in the end, no one ends up winning. So that's sort of the fun, frolicky, and ultimately extremely scary side. On the other side, you have the people doing serious work with finances, and that includes the banks, the stock exchanges, uh, financial companies, and your credit cards, and so on. And they have over the years been somewhat disrupted by open source. Like in the late 90s, early aughts, the stock exchanges all went over to Linux as their foundational operating system. And but that was just sort of like deep infrastructure. Now, though, the financial companies have woken us to realize that we need to interoperate with each other. We need to have a much more transparent, less friction between the application on your phone that says you want to buy a ticket from, say, Ticketmaster. Horrible company, by the way. But how can they smooth that out so that if whether you use an American Express, a Visa, a MasterCard, whatever, the transaction is smooth, transparent, and works across a variety of different platforms. Because at the moment, it may look transparent to you on this side, but it's pretty darn mucky back there in the back rooms of where all this stuff hooks together. And it's also very expensive to do this. So for the longest time, if somebody wanted to say start taking Discover cards, I don't know if they have them in South Africa, but it's a fairly popular in the United States, but minor league uh, credit card. And being able to write the code to do that, it's done proprietarily in house. It's difficult, and so every store, every vendor who wants to do this, they have to write their own code. And just like in every other business, sooner or later people wake up and realize, do we really want to reinvent the wheel? I mean, we know credit cards, we know other people accept Discover. Why do we have to do this in a proprietary manner? And now, for a long time there, banks, which tend to be very conservative operations, said, no, 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 we don't want to do this in an open way. But over time, they've realized that open source is not as scary, dangerous as they always thought it was, and that this just makes a whole lot more sense to do this in an open source way, and not just to be an open source code consumer, but let's share some of our thoughts along with the other companies, and so we can all work together, and we'll compete on other things rather than our code bases, because at the end of the day, and why open source has beat everybody else into submission, everything, in all other aspects of software development, is it's just easier if we all work together. We can then compete on other issues, and rather than on fundamental code. And these companies are realizing this. They're also realizing that open standards make a whole lot of sense as well. Who needs 23 different standards on how to process a credit card transaction if we could just all agree on one? If we could say, for the apps on your phone, wouldn't it be nice if we just had one open API? Because at the end of the day, it's always about, I'm going to pay you X for Y, and you're going to return Y for me for X, and it will be logged and audited in such a manner. It really makes a whole lot more sense if you just have an open standards all the way through. And it's moving slowly, but it's I see open source in many industries acting like it's like a little snowball you start with, and then suddenly you have an avalanche, and you've got huge mounds of snow bounding down the mountain. And I think, man, the VCs also think, which is more important than what I think, that these transformations are on the way of happening. And again, people on the street won't notice that much of a difference, but it will make an enormous difference, though, for really anyone in financial transactions. Hopefully, that means that, like, if I'm a little store here and I'm taking credit cards, I may actually see the percentage I have to pay to the credit card company go down, because it's not going to cost them as much money to handle all those transactions, because it adds up.
Do you? Yeah, no, for sure. Do you think that having an open standard like this for how you process payments can then have the knock-on effect of opening up the ability to be a payment processor to a wider world? Because like Africa is very underserved here, right? Like we don't have
Right,
Stripe. We can't accept
right,
Stripe as a payment method. And
right.
I don't know if that is because of a business decision on Stripe's end, or whether it's because of an interoperability problem that they have with the way banks operate in Africa. So I'm wondering if something like an open standard like that could have like these beneficial impacts of empowering a whole continent, so to speak.
I don't know about the specifics of Stripe in Africa. I do know, though, that open standards like this would, I think, help African banks and other financial institutions, because it would help level the playing field. If I can use an open source solution and with open standards, uh, instead of having to pay someone money for a proprietary solution, or maybe they're just simply not interested in dealing with me because they think that my market is too small for them to care about. Uh, I think I could see that making a real difference. It's like how smartphones are so vital to the much more, I mean, certainly they're a huge deal here in the States, But in places like Kenya, if I mean everything runs on smartphones. I mean it's just 4G is is how business is done, and if you can put applications that make money managing and transaction easier on the low power of a smartphone, that would certainly help them.
Yep, I 100% agree. That's exciting to know that something like that is coming down the pipe. Now, to pivot a little bit, we've talked about a lot
Hmm.
of positive things,
Right.
and so we'll take the elephant out of the closet, so to speak, and go there, or is it a big bird? Um, so Twitter, Twitter,
Hmm.
Twitter happened. And this is actually the topic that I alluded to in the beginning of the podcast, which I
Hmm.
know you did some
Right.
research in, and I know
Hmm.
you eventually got a exclusive interview with Will Norris, who's Twitter's former open source lead, and
Right.
he shared some interesting information with you that I'd love you to share with us.
Hmm.
The one quote
Sure.
I really loved from him is that he said, "I don't care how much you call yourself hardcore. Open source communities
Hmm.
are built on relationships and trust, and now Twitter has
Hmm.
neither."
Yep.
I love it, but at the same time, it's like, boom, it's as Elon said, let that sink in. So I don't know. It's a little scary to think that Twitter has decided to turn its, or should I say, Elon has decided to turn his back on open source at
Hmm.
Twitter. What do you think are potentially some of the biggest impacts of that decision and about all these people that's no longer at Twitter?
Well, uh, Twitter will fail, and it's just some components of it are not working properly at the moment, and they're not going to get fixed anytime soon because no one is there who knows. It's not even a matter of they no longer have people who know how to solve a particular problem. They no longer have people who know enough to know if there is a problem. I mean, there's no one there to read the logs and look at the audit trails and go, something's screwy here. Uh, I am a bit surprised that it made it through the World Cup without collapsing. But
Hmm.
you know, it's just a matter of time. It really is, and something will eventually go bang, and it will not be an easy fix. They they literally don't have the people to fix this kind of stuff. Moving forward,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like adding features. I mean, you can sort of slap on features like the new blue is a slap on feature. It doesn't actually do anything fundamentally
Yep.
different with the underlying code. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't really add anything of value either. It will have problems. It will go. Um, Bad things will happen with it. It's just it's just it's hard for me to say because there are so many potentially terrible things that could go on here, and he's not helping himself any. Yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
he said, "Vote. Should I continue to run Twitter?" And the vote is in. The people said no. Now, what's he going to
Yep.
do
Yep.
now? Who
Saw that.
knows? Yeah. Of Is he going to take Twitter into bankruptcy? I've seen that suggested at times. It certainly is not worth the billions he
Mm.
paid for it. Of course, he knew that going in, but he charged ahead
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway. And certainly,
Mm-hmm.
people in his other more successful operations, such as Tesla and SpaceX, they would much rather have him pay attention to, you know, getting the teething problems out of the Tesla Semi, which are then the first of them are now actually on the roads. It'd be nice if we saw the
Mm,
production
mm.
lines for that being cleaned up, and because that's still going painfully slow. Instead, though, he's spending all of his time, making headlines and annoying people, but not really doing anything for his business, for the Twitter business. Um,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
it's just it's ugly. I feel really sorry for the developers who have been caught in this. It's still ongoing. Even this last Friday, he let go of some more developers, and
Oh boy.
you just you can't do this. I mean, Tesla engineers are
Yeah.
they're really good at managing electrical flow and battery life, and mastering self-driving on embedded systems. That's great, but none of that translates into skills for a social network. And
Mm, mm, mm.
wow, it's just, what were you thinking?
I mean, it seems to me like turning your back on open source at this point is completely the opposite thing of what you should have done. Do you have any idea, like, why would he have decided that that is a negative thing for Twitter to have all these open source things? Does he? Do you think he perhaps just feels it takes up too much time of the engineers that they should be spending on working on making Twitter more profitable?
um, I honestly, I don't think it's that he's so much anti-open source as I think he honestly does not understand the business. He really just doesn't get it. Uh, and
Mm, mm,
uh, I mean, he at the very it's beside okay. Looking at from other, he alienates their advertisers immediately. And Blue was not making
mm-hmm,
any money. Any money, well, Twitter doesn't make money. Twitter burns money, but any cash flow they had was coming from their advertisers. And to alienate them
mm-hmm,
immediately, it's just, what are you doing? He fired also a bunch of the
yeah,
ad people. Okay, I understand he hated the people on the top. Fine, get rid of the C-level people. But you still need the top level salespeople to go out there, get those contracts, bring in the money, and they're gone now too. Who does that?
mm,
Uh,
mm,
I certainly care. The open source part is what I care about, and just the whole technology stack.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But it's
mm-hmm.
not just the technology stack that's getting hammered. It's all these other aspects of the business as well.
Do you think Mastodon is ready to take over as a new
No,
concept of social media?
I like Mastodon. I like the code. It's getting. They've been making some serious improvements in that code base lately, and yay Mastodon.
Mm-hmm,
But I don't see anyone out there at this time having a Twitter killer or a Twitter replacement. Uh,
mm.
Mastodon does not scale all that well. Uh, every Mastodon, what do they call it? They call them pods, I think. Oh well. If there are any
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Mastodon tech people, forgive me. There's so many social networks out there, I can't keep track of the exact technical details of each of them. But they're essentially you have all these independent little pods out there, and they all connect with each other using protocols, and that seems to be scaling pretty well. But at
Mm-hmm,
the end of the day, you still have all these individual little islands out there. So each island runs itself with its own set of rules and so on. And again, it doesn't particularly scale that well. And maybe it will, but I like being on Mastodon. I will be moving pretty much everything lock, stock, and barrel off of Twitter shortly onto Mastodon because I've just gotten really tired of hanging into Twitter as long as I have. It just hasn't. It's no longer worth it to me. But
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
again, I look at all the others, counter social, post news, and so on, and nobody really quite has it together yet. I think Mastodon is going to be very important. It's going to be the how to put it. It's going to be what I think most people will be using for the next year or so. But I think something else may yet end up replacing Twitter. But I don't think at this point it will be Mastodon.
Do you think that there's room for a company such as Mozilla to disrupt this space, building off of something like Mastodon, but building in their sense of mission and safety and keeping the internet open and free?
I think Mozilla, had it started earlier in this space, might have had more of an influence. The Mozilla Foundation lately has been, excuse me, much more conservative. They've sort of pulled back. I mean, they pulled back from
Mm-hmm.
Rust, which I think was a big strategic mistake. And
Mm.
I don't know. I used to have a whole lot more faith in Firefox and Mozilla than I do now. And now I see Mozilla as being sort
Okay.
of a very conservative organization. I don't see them really moving forward that much. Even Firefox itself, um, it's just, I don't know. It just seems sort of like a tired project to me. I mean,
Mm,
I wish
interesting.
I didn't. I used to love Firefox, but it's just for the last few years I have not been that impressed. And from a strategic point of view, and it would take a strategic shift. I just don't see
Mm-hmm.
Mozilla making that kind of move. It would be nice if they did, but again, I just don't see Mozilla doing that.
Mm. So you're thinking we need a disruptor like what Mozilla used to be.
Yeah. I think right now the time is ripe for a social network disruptor. I don't know who that might be, because again, I've been looking at a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
other alternatives, and I like them, but I don't see anyone who's impressed me yet. I don't see anyone who said, let's reinvent the wheel, because right now, actually, this is a time where we could reinvent the wheel. And I think there's room
Yeah,
for a
yeah.
new social network that actually does pay serious attention to both free speech and at the same time keeping enough control to keep it uh, Twitter or any social network from becoming a 4chan or 8chan or any of those other
Mm,
cesspools
mm.
of social network.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's definitely advisable. So, this has been a lovely conversation, very insightful. A lot of things to think about. I have two closing questions for
Sure.
you. I think I'll start with the last one, and then ask the one I was going to ask second to last. So, what is your hope, and if you feel so obliged, predictions for the open source ecosystem over the next, say, 5 years?
Oh, goodness. I think it's going to continue to become more important. I think we have had a wake up call on the security side because we have been forced to realize that the software supply chain, we've got to do a better job of securing it, whether
Mm, yep.
and just knowing what the heck is in it. Software bills of material, SBOMs, are going to continue to become much more important. Uh, all of that's going to take time. People have historically, developers have put security a long way in the back of their list of things they want to get done. We can't be so cavalier about it now because, as the Log4j fiasco revealed, we can have software that is way, way in the background that millions of people depend on every day, and they have no clue what this program even was, where it came from, what it does. And then, wow, suddenly all this code, all these programs are going awry, and they're still going awry to this day. That Log4j is not a solved problem yet. Should be. The code is fixed, but the all the programs based around that code, some of them still haven't been patched, and I'm sure some of the people out there are running buggy code that they don't even know that it's causing havoc in their systems. They just think things are running really slow. It's going to be a fundamental shift in putting security forward, and a lot of developers won't like it because it's not as fun as creating a new feature or making something run even faster, but it's essential. It really is. It's just essential.
Seeing that the whole world runs on open source, we better make sure it's secure.
Exactly.
And then, in closing, what is the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
Best piece of advice I ever received. Oh, goodness gracious me. I guess go for it. Way back there I was, back there on the IBM mainframe talking to people. I already knew some people in technology journalism, and I asked them, I'm good at all this tech stuff. I'm good at explaining it. I think actually I would be happiest explaining technology to people and to businesses. And how should I do that? And they gave me a lot of very practical and specific advice. And as they like to say, after years later, they said I'm the only person whoever asked them for advice about how to become a writer, who actually then went out there and did what they said, and gosh, it worked. And so I encourage people to, if you think you have a good idea, talk to other people, and if they say yes, that's a good idea, that's a good career path, that's a good project, do it. Just don't wait, don't hesitate. Once you know what you really want to do, once you've got your resources lined up, go out there and make it happen. It may just work for you, and you may find yourself years later very happily continuing to do what you thought you could never do much earlier in your life.
Yeah, that's a lovely piece of advice, and that's a great place to end it. So thanks so much, Stephen. I'm glad we finally made this happen. I hope you feel better much very soon, and I'll speak to you on Slack and everywhere else. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Ta.
Thank you for listening to the Mechanical Inc. podcast. Join the conversation on Discord. All the links are in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share it with your friends and colleagues. If you have a moment, please leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts, as this helps others find us and helps us make a better podcast for you, our listeners.